My name's Leah Rogers, and I live here in Mount Vernon. I'm only a 6-year resident of the town, so I can't claim to have too much history here. But I do work in historic preservation. I'm both an archaeologist and an architectural historian, so I wear a couple of different hats. I'm going to talk today about two things: design review and guidelines for historic properties in Mount Vernon. And the Mount Vernon Historic Preservation Commission has completed somewhat of a final draft of our design guidelines. And most of you may have gotten one if you're a property owner in one of the historic districts. We sent out about 200 in, early February, I believe, for comments. This has gone through quite a process of comments and critiques. And we do know it still needs work. So we're hoping that if you don't have one, you'll take one with you today and read it through and let us know how we can improve this, because we want to make this as user-friendly as possible, as easy to understand as possible. One other thing before I get into this, I forgot I was supposed to remind you, if you came in during Dick's talk, you need to sign in before you leave, because we do need to have a record of who is here. And we also... Okay. So please sign in. And also we finally figured out that maybe for an evaluation form we could just use the program for today. So if you just want to write some comments on the program and leave it here before you leave, we'd really appreciate it, because we'd also like to know how to improve this seminar for the next time that we do it. Okay, back to guidelines. I'm going to talk about the guidelines first, and then I'm going to get into design review. Now, these guidelines are intended to assist property owners in the proper methods and techniques for restoring, rehabilitating, and repairing their historic buildings, because there are right things to do and there are wrong things to do. And unfortunately, some of the wrong things can seriously damage your historic home. So we want to be sure that you are educated about your particular home and its particular needs before you undertake any major restoration projects. Locally relevant guidelines, and these are specifically written for the city of Mount Vernon. So these are specifically tailored with illustrations from the community, specifically keen on what are the important components of our historic buildings. And locally relevant guidelines and techniques and a design review process are recommended by the National Park Service as the best tools for historic preservation in any community. Now, the Mount Vernon Commission was also concerned that inappropriate alterations to buildings in the city's historic districts would negatively impact the historic integrity of these buildings and jeopardize both preservation efforts in the community as well as potentially the National Register status of the districts themselves. If too much alteration or too much modern infill occurs, it can jeopardize the status of the whole district or a portion thereof. So there is a concern about that. As I said, we tried to make these guidelines as user-friendly as possible. We did formulate them using the National Park Service's, specifically the Secretary of Interior's guidelines and standards for restoration and rehabilitation of historic buildings. This is their illustrated guide. A little bigger than ours, but this covers a lot more other types of situations that we don't have here in the community. So this is more relevant to what we have here. But this is what it was based on as the initial Bible, so to speak, of the do's and don'ts, what's recommended and what isn't recommended related to restoration of historic properties. There is also a smaller version of this. It's a little easier to carry around that's just text. That is the guidelines, and it's a red book. I don't happen to have an example of that. These are available through the National Park Service. They're free in the sense that you don't pay anything for them other than the tax dollars it took to put it together. So take advantage of this, because these are available. And this one also has photographs and illustrations to help understand the process a little better. Get some of these out of the way here. Now this version is now being printed with the Ada II grants, and I need to mention this because we are getting some assistance from Lynn County's nonprofit historical project program, as well as from the Certified Local Government Grants Program. And that's administered through the National Park Service, through the State Historical Society of Iowa. So those are two funding sources that are helping us to put this together and get it printed out. As I said, we had 200 advance copies that have already gone out, so hopefully we'll get some comments back soon. And hopefully this workshop will also give us some more comments, because it does need to be refined. Once we get our final review done this spring, I assume, is when it's going to be done, we're then going to print up at least 1,500 copies. And that'll be done by this summer. And those will go to all of the property owners and all of the residents in Mount Vernon, as well as hopefully holding on to a certain number for reserve for new people who move into this area. Now, to get into the need for guidelines and what they can and cannot do for you, I first want to relate a few preservation principles or axioms, some of which might surprise you. Number one, the less changed, the better. And interestingly enough, this is often the most cost-effective way to go as well. And I'll use an example of a masonry building. Unless you've got an example that has been seriously neglected and hasn't been repointed as it needed it through the years, rarely will you need to repoint a whole building all at once. And you really only want to repair what needs to be repaired. Number two, it's better to maintain than to repair. And if a building is properly cared for and maintained on a regular basis, it may never need major repairs. Another cost saver. Number three, retain where possible what is original. Now, this is recognizing that all houses go through changes and that some of those changes in and of themselves may be significant, and you may need to retain those as well. You want to educate yourself about your particular home, and we do have some architectural studies from the city of Mount Vernon, all kinds of guides that have pointed out what is important in this community. The guideline booklet points out what some of those components, such as the decorative elements in gable ends and porches and things like that, to help you identify what's original on your house and what you should retain if you can. Number four, repair what is deteriorated. Why get rid of something if it can be repaired? Because I can guarantee you, in today's world, you cannot get the same quality of materials, particularly wood, that you could get 50 to 100 years ago. And in some cases, it's very difficult to duplicate the same type of workmanship as well. So if it can be repaired, repair it. And finally, and this is in a hierarchical thing at the bottom of the level, replace only where no other alternative is available, and then replace, if you can, with like materials and like design. Now, once again, there is a recognition that that's not always economically feasible. It's not always physically feasible. And there is a growing acceptance of certain types of substitute materials. There are now some epoxies for wood replacement that work very well. They achieve a very desirable look, very compatible. And so these are becoming very accepted by the National Park Service. So you just need to educate yourself about what is good out there, what kind of new products are on the market, and what preservationists have tried and recommended and found to work. Now, what can these guidelines accomplish all by themselves without design review? This is just the guidelines by themselves. They can help reinforce the character of a historic district and protect its visual aspects. It can improve the quality of growth and development. Very important for property owners. It can protect the value of your public and private investments. It can preserve the integrity of a historic area by discouraging the construction of buildings that are inappropriate. And I'm going to point to one example here. This is in the Ash Park District. It's one of 3 National Register listed districts in this community. Dick already told you about the Cornell College District, which includes the campus as well as some of the residential areas around the edge of the campus. Ash Park is up in the northwest corner of town. It's the one residential district that we have so far. And then we have our commercial district here along First Street is also listed in the National Register. Now, here's the case where, if I recall correctly, there is enough of a lot in between these 2 houses on this block that a new house probably could be built there. And that may be a possibility in the future, depending on how land use changes in this area. And the type of house that gets built there could have a very dramatic impact on this district. You know, it's not just what happens on that lot, it's how it affects the visual impact of that whole block area. And these are some of the more significant homes in the Ash Park district, so it could have a real deleterious effect on the district as a whole. If you stuck a modular home in there, for example, it could have some serious impact. So guidelines can maybe help give people some better ideas about what some of the alternatives and options are out there to be a little more creative, perhaps, in new construction as well as in restoration and repairs that are done to a building. There's another example, a large lot in between two of the older homes. Those are not focusing very well. Where an inappropriate building put in there could really have a serious damaging impact. Guidelines can also discourage inappropriate alterations of historic properties, and I'll go back to that first one. Porches, very important. The different siding materials, very important. The decorative elements in gable ends are very important. And some of these have more of an impact than others. Porches are a pretty big impact when you start removing porches and replacing them with materials that may not be appropriate or a style that has nothing to do with the history of the area. So hopefully guidelines can give people other ideas, other alternatives to doing things that may be inappropriate in their historic district. Now guidelines can also provide an objective basis for the decisions made by a design review board if one is enacted. It can also serve as a tool for architects and their clients in making design choices upfront, ahead of time. And it can increase public awareness of what these options are. Education is the main reason for doing these guidelines. Now, what can they not accomplish by themselves? They cannot limit growth. They cannot regulate where growth takes place. They cannot control how space inside a building is used. These guidelines are only concerned with the exterior, and then with the exterior from the public view of the property. They cannot guarantee that all new construction will be compatible with the historic setting, and the guidelines by themselves cannot guarantee high quality construction either. Here's another case where education is the key. If you're an owner of a historic house, you need to be aware what is proper for your particular building, and be aware that it's going to take time, it's going to take money, and you're going to need to find qualified craftspeople and qualified architects to help do your restoration, people who are experienced in working in old buildings. And there's always that old saying that you get what you pay for, and it's probably no truer than for historic building restorations. Someone else can always do it faster and cheaper, but they may end up doing something to your historic building that's going to end up costing more to repair in the long run, and they may do something like sandblasting that may not be repairable. And you can do serious harm, particularly to masonry structures, with certain types of techniques that are still being used out there. They're still being marketed by some contractors and persons out there working on historic homes. So you need to be aware of what is proper and what is not proper for your particular home. Now, the design review process. To strengthen the effectiveness of design guidelines, a community must have a design review process that is part of the legal structure of the city government. Now, the first objection always is going to be private property rights, and this is a sacred ideal in this country. However, I would imagine that most of you are here today because you own a historic building or live in a historic house, or at least have an interest in the historic buildings of this community. Now, why did you buy an old building? Because they come with all kinds of problems. They're not necessarily cheaper to buy unless they're a fixer-upper than a new built construction. So why did you buy one? I know why I did. I live in a house that was built in 1923. It's one of my favorite times of architectural styles. It's a craftsman bungalow type house. And I know why I bought it. It's not just because I work in historic preservation. It's because of the quality of materials they're built with, the quality of construction, the charm, the character, the look. Just things you can't get with new built construction often, unless it's done with good creativity. You cannot build a home today with the kind of materials they could get 50 to 100 years ago. Lumber in particular, you can't get the kind of old growth lumber with the density and the durability that you could then. You can't get that anymore. Construction methods have changed. There's so much prefabrication now. It's not the same quality of construction that it was back then. And a lot of what's built today won't be here 100 years from now. It just won't last. But an older building, if it's taken care of, can be here forever if it's taken care of. And all you have to do is look at the building stock of Europe to understand what maintenance and care can do for the longevity of a structure. It will last. You just have to take care of it. But in buying an older house, you need to understand that you are just one in a line of maybe many owners of that house, both past and into the future. And for the present, you're not just that building's owner, but you're that building's steward. And the future of that property can literally rest with you. It has been noted, and I will quote here, that history, architecture, the character of the neighborhood, and the town are really important, that we are all part of a community that was here before us and will be here long after we are gone, and that the community has a long-term interest in protecting its character. And in a community such as Mount Vernon, no property isn't an island in and of itself. The community as a whole does have an interest in maintaining and protecting and preserving what so many people who come to this town remark about, is the look of it. The wonderful legacy that we have in the historic building stock of this community, and how obvious it is that the people who live here care about that and have taken care of it through the years. Now, if we're not good stewards of those properties, and if they're lost, what will visitors of the future to Mount Vernon have to say about this community? People are attracted to Mount Vernon. I know I was attracted specifically to Mount Vernon, in large part because of the way it looks. And even the casual visitor driving through can notice that. The process of design review and the guidelines will go a long way to ensure that this community will be even more of a treasure 100 years from now. Now, this is not to say that the design review process or the guidelines are intended to stifle or discourage growth or change. Quite the contrary. Some growth and change is always good. Historic houses change all the time, and sometimes that becomes a significant component of their architecture. What they will discourage, and I can't say this strongly enough, what they will discourage is needless alteration and loss when there are other options and other alternatives that might achieve the very same goal and be a better investment of your money in the long run for the property owner. Now, in Mount Vernon, what we're proposing for the design review process will be part of the planning and zoning ordinance. And for now, it will simply apply just to the historic districts, the National Register districts, within the city's boundaries. But the process will allow for the designation of local districts and local landmarks as needed and as desired. Now, when a property owner comes in for a building permit to do whatever you want to do that would require a building permit according to our existing planning and zoning ordinance, they will be required to submit their preliminary design for what they want to do to the Historic Preservation Commission for a review that is based on these guidelines and on the Secretary of Interior standards and guidelines. And once they review the design, then one of three things will happen. The Commission will either issue a certificate of appropriateness to go along with the building permit that approves the submitted design. It's found to be entirely appropriate for that area, and there are no objections to what's being proposed. Or they may recommend changes in the design as a condition of approval. Once again, perhaps it's a situation where they just haven't thought through what some of their alternatives might be, and identifying what some of those alternatives are would be part of the process. The third one would be denying the submitted design if it's wholly inappropriate, if it will do serious damage to the integrity of the building and the district's integrity, or if somebody hasn't responded to some of the recommended alternatives. In each of these cases, the review is going to be based on best practices in historic preservation, and these are going to be substantiated best practices. And there is an appeals process that will be part of this as well. Obtaining the certificate of appropriateness would be the condition for approval of, would be one of the conditions for approval of the building permit. Of course, there's other things that come into the planning and zoning ordinance that would have to be considered as well. It should be noted that one major goal in doing the guidelines in the first place is simply to better educate property owners and residents about their historic buildings, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what can do harm, what's the best method for doing something. And it will always be through education more so than any type of regulation that will provide the greatest returns for historic preservation in this community. Now, where do you get all this information? There's a lot of information in the guidelines themselves. I'll go through a little bit of that in a moment. There's so much information out there that can be had just for the asking. The National Park Service puts out a whole series of different types of guides for specific problems. This one's about masonry deterioration. It's a glossary, real handy. You can stick it in your pocket and take it along with you, showing you how to identify masonry problems, what they are, and how you treat that specific problem. Here's a catalog that just has all their preservation publications in it that you can order from. These are some of the National Park Service's preservation briefs, which all key in on specific things. This one has to do with exterior paint problems. This one's the danger of abrasive cleaning of masonry. I got concrete and repointing of historic buildings. These are just one of, just a few of the very many briefs that they have. And I will say, these are written so that everyone can understand them. They're not just written for people who work in historic preservation and have some education and background in that. So they use a lot of illustrations. They use a lot of real specific types of information on the do's and don'ts for historic buildings. The National Trust for Historic Preservation also has a series of publications, and a lot of it is a compilation of the stuff from the National Park Service. This whole book's about masonry. And it even goes down to how to hire a contractor, how to put together a contract, what to look for, what to do, what not to do, and how to identify some of the problems with your particular property. There's also the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training. They put out information. And if you're on the internet, there's a number of different websites you can take advantage of. I got these 3 preservation briefs off the Old House Journal website. One's on cleaning and waterproof coating of masonry buildings. This one's on repointing, and this one's on concrete. And I know we've also pulled some other ones off for some of the other seminars later today on painting and some of the other issues on restoration. So if you got internet access and a printer, that's all you need to get those. There's just a wealth of information out there, lots of books that have been written. So you just need to educate yourself. Let me go through the rest of the slides here. There's a lot of things you could do to your buildings that, like I said, have a tremendous impact. It may work for a particular problem, maybe. It may solve a property owner's particular need at the moment, but it can also have a tremendous impact on the district as a whole. This is one of the corner buildings in the district. It's one of the first things you see when you come into town. The impact would have been lesser if it wasn't a corner building. This is a masonry structure. It does have a repointing problem that does need to be addressed. It is an expensive undertaking. And this was a solution to that. The problem is when you do something like cover-up siding, and there's all kinds of different cover-up siding that you see historic masonry buildings done with, is that you're masking the problem. The problem's still there. The problem's still festering. It's still getting worse. But now you can't see it. So it's even more difficult to maintain it. Plus, visually, this just has a tremendous impact on the remainder of the district, and these are the buildings next to it. Now, there are other things along the way that, I just don't want to pick on that building in particular, because each one of these buildings have things that could be done a little better, and hopefully will as things get done to these buildings in the future. Things like the metal storefronts that were so popular in the 1960s really detracts from the historic look of the district. The reduction of second floor windows was a real popular thing to do in the 1970s when we were so energy conscious. There are so many windows these days and so many ways to repair historic windows today that were better than what we had in the 1970s, that you can make them energy efficient without having to go to this reduction idea. Simple things like covering up the transom windows and then painting the boards that you cover them up with white. It's really detracting from Billy Bob's there, is the one I'm pointing at, is really detracting. It's the first thing you see when you look at that building, and it's a real simple thing to correct. So these are just maybe suggestions and ideas that come from the guidelines that as people begin to work on and maintain their property and have to replace things as time goes on, that they might become educated about what some of the better alternatives might be. Now, the guidelines. I've taken just a few examples out of the guidelines themselves. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, we tried to make them as simple and as clear as possible and to illustrate what we're talking about. We have sections on commercial properties. This is one from the commercial properties that specifically addresses signage. You can see that very well. What's recommended versus what's not recommended. The example on the right, as you can see, it's an advertising gimmick, but it also has a very dramatic impact on the building too. I mean, what you see is the pizza sign, not the building itself. It's really detracted from the historic look of the building itself. Display window. The one on the left with the large glass panes versus the idea of reducing them for either it's the most expedient thing to do or the idea that it might be energy efficient. But you've really changed the overall look and impact of the building. It's a very dramatic thing. It almost makes it look like the building's looking at you on the right-hand side. Those are the kinds of things that we would like to discourage. In the residential section, simple things, we go through a different variety of all the different things you might encounter, you might want to do to your historic building. This one is specifically about siding. Once again, the axioms of retain what is original wherever possible, repair it if it can be repaired, and replace only if there is no other alternative. Because once again, even with wood siding on here, and some wood siding does need to be replaced. It does get cracked and rotted and sometimes needs to be replaced. But just keep in mind, you're not going to get the same quality of siding that you could have 50 years ago. So just be very sure that's what you need to do before you do it. Not recommended any type of synthetic siding, particularly something that dramatically changes the historic look of the building. This includes vinyl and aluminum siding. They're always marketed as permanent siding or no maintenance siding. And they are for a time, but I will tell you there's no such thing as permanent siding. Everything needs to be eventually maintained. It will need to be refurbished. 15 to 20 years from now, that aluminum siding will need to be painted. The vinyl siding is going to be faded. It will have to be either painted or replaced in its entirety. If you have a good paint job, and if it's a high quality job with good quality paint, can last 15 years. And to repaint the house is not going to cost any more than having to put vinyl siding on your house again. Plus, when you put vinyl siding on, if you put it on for a reason that maybe you had siding that wouldn't hold paint for some reason anymore, chances are you have a moisture problem. And that's why the paint is popping off. Well, if you put vinyl siding or aluminum siding over that and you don't correct that moisture problem, that problem's going to be there, it's going to fester, it's going to get worse until you're going to do some serious damage to your structure. And you're not going to be able to see it because it's going to be masked by that synthetic siding. Paint and color, we have a little section on that, and I won't go into that because we're going to be talking about that later this afternoon. But some of the recommended versus not recommended, using examples from here in the community, what's appropriate in Mount Vernon. Keen in on some of those significant components of the architecture in this community. And if you start looking at the building stock, the residential properties in particular, you'll see how important the gable ends and their decorative treatment are. You see this repeated over and over and again, and it's something that goes across a lot of the architectural styles, particularly the later styles in this community. Now, we recently added a section on outbuildings, and this is one that's not really addressed in the Secretary of Interior standards except in a very broad way. Didn't do that very well. And there is a lot of outbuilding construction going on in this community. And here's an example either near or within the Ash Park district. I'm not exactly sure where the boundary begins and ends in this area, but here's a good example. The blue one in the middle there, actually is very intriguing. It's got a good scale to it. It's also a detached structure. Most of the historic houses in this community, except for some of the later bungalow styles, getting into the World War II era, the garages were separate structures because they came after the house was built. And the carriage houses that we have left, of course, are still detached buildings. So this new construction here is a detached structure. It's fairly small in scale. Now, some things that we might have suggested as alternatives to consider might have been a steeper pitch to the roof, perhaps. You'd want to look at what is there historically. There's a lot of outbuildings in that area. What's the pitch of those roofs? Perhaps a front gabled orientation as opposed to a side gable might have worked a little better. But still, that's headed in the right direction. Now, the one next to it, the White House, is also brand new construction. And a couple of things there that are problems is it's attached to the house. It's very large. It's obscuring two major views of the house. And so here's the situation where we would hope that maybe we could encourage through the guidelines a more compatible type of outbuilding construction here rather than going in that direction. Now, the guidelines as an educational tool, also in the back, if you got to the back of it, has some instructions on things like cleaning and repairs for masonry, some of these do's and don'ts related to masonry and wood siding and things like that. We also have a list of where you can get help. These include the commission here in this community, as well as the State Historical Society of Iowa, and some of the national programs where you can also get help, and a booklet. And a lot of these are right here in the Cole Library. More how-to learn more about your house and what should and shouldn't be done to it. Now, we do have with us today somebody from the State Historical Society. And Carrie, if you'd like to stand up. Carrie? This is Carrie McGrath, and she works with she's the coordinator of the Certified Local Governments Grants Program for the State Historical Society, and she was good enough to come. So if we can't answer some of the questions you have, maybe she can as well. And I know Ed would like to come up and answer some questions too. So why don't we open it up for questions, because there may be quite a few. Yes?
Original condition, supposed to be in construction, but it's for a carriage, it's not for my Lincoln. I would be quite happy to build a garage with some sort of attachment to that carriage house if I could get to it. Unfortunately, you sold one of the major alleyways that goes to it. If I don't have an approach to it, how can I build something that's going to be within character and still make it appropriate for my car? I want to keep the carriage house, but you have to give me access to it. Is the city going to continue to sell our alleyways?
I don't know if I could answer that. Perhaps
We don't have anybody from the city here, do we? I can't comment on that necessarily. I know that probably once an alley is sold, the chances of getting it back are almost non-existent. The key is, and the problem is that probably whoever lived there before you didn't really have an inclination one way or another, and so it went by the wayside. That may be something that we want to factor into our considerations, is whether garage access to garages in the back.
Right.
They're going to be detached. The alleys have to be there for them. I think anyway, in my estimation, that's a sizable kind of investment to make to keep it historically correct and to detach it. I mean, that's for a lot of homeowners, just detaching it from the home itself is kind of a sacrifice. But if you're willing to do that, then the city should be willing to cooperate and keep our alleyways as part of the city instead of selling them off. I don't think there's ever a reason to sell off an alley. I think it's part of the integral structure of the Midwest community.
Yeah, I think, the trend to sell off alleys is a function of the modern trend to put garages so they're accessible from the street as opposed to the alley. And what we're saying, because of historic preservation, is we'd like to see more of the older type of garages. We aren't dictating that be done, but certainly we certainly wouldn't want to discourage it. But yet, getting rid of the alley access is a discouragement to that type of thing. Do you have a comment, Dick?
Yeah, I think it's true that the city is less likely to sell an alley. There's always some discussion about that. I think they're less likely to do it.
It's also my understanding that if your property abuts onto an alley and you object to that alley being sold, it's a factor law for sale.
Right.
Yeah.
That any one property owner objects.
All it takes is probably one property owner to object, but there's usually only about 4 or 5 that are, everyone likes to have that extra 8.5 square feet or whatever it turns out, so.
The other thing I would say is that keep in mind that the thrust of the guidelines themselves and the design review process would be on the public views of any property. And there may be many cases where the construction of a new garage, as long as it's not obscuring a view, may be entirely appropriate for that area or entirely approvable in that area.
I also wanted to mention that the design review process that we are contemplating, we don't want to turn this into a Williamsburg, Virginia. We aren't
Right.
a Williamsburg, Virginia. Buildings will be added on to, changes will be made. You may have a house that's changed into an apartment, a variety of different things. Our goal is to make sure that it's done in a way that doesn't detract from the historical significance of the buildings in the districts. We're not here to prevent growth, prevent changes. We just want to help guide those changes so that they're more appropriate. I also wanted to add is that we do have a community-wide steering committee, which is composed of not only people who are in favor of guidelines, but also people who may have questions or may be totally opposed to them. We will be having another meeting probably within the next month or two. So if there's anyone here that would like to participate in that process, make sure you get in touch with us so we can add you to the name or to the list. Jane?
Kind of looked into with the city, if you want a partnership of something, that they really don't maintain alleys. The city doesn't in any way that I'm aware of. And you might get a couple of neighbors that don't use the alley, they could care less. You get a couple that do use, and I know we've put rock with our neighbor to try to help maintain that alley because we've used it. And so I think that there's a real discrepancy of how the city views the alleys and which would encourage people to put their buildings in the alley. I don't know where that would go, but I just think it might be something to look into. People might be more willing to use the alley if they knew that there was some kind of a partnership with the city on this.
Yeah, you bring up another issue. Just maintaining the access is one thing. Maintaining the alley is something that enters into the budget of the city and a whole series of other constraints. Yes?
Area in the town, either the commercial area or the residential.
The areas that are currently national registers, the boundaries of those will probably not be expanded. The commercial district, for example, when we applied for the national register status, it was larger than what it currently is, but they found that there were certain buildings that had been modified to the point where they shouldn't be included, and so the boundaries were reduced. Chances of expanding those boundaries are pretty slim. On the other token, though, as Dick Thomas mentioned earlier, we are looking at a fourth national district, which is probably the last district that we'll have that would be of national status. There would be a non-contiguous district of brick structures throughout the city. So that would be the fourth national district we would have. In addition to that, you have individual structures that may not fall within the boundaries of any of those particular structures that might be of national register status of their own. And then lastly, we'll have the authority to create districts of local significance. if you look at the boundaries of the districts that we have, there's a tremendous number of nice buildings that don't fall within any of those boundaries. But they still may be relevant to the city because they were part of the original town or part of growth during a certain area. It's well into the future, but we're looking at other areas of local significance. So you have multiple layers of historic districts. The national ones, the brick structure is probably the last one that we'll have that might be of national status. After that, we move into local structures.
Yeah.
One of the things I looked through your book, it's a really nice book, I have a question, is mortar recipes.
Okay. Kind of becomes, there's so many things that could be put in it.
Or software building.
Right. A lot of these books have just that in them. And maybe we should, maybe an annotated bibliography might be an idea to tell you what's in what particular source, because these do have those specific recipes in them.
Kill your software building.
Right.
Yeah, I'll have to look at that closer, and probably at least some reference to using a soft mortar mix as opposed to a high Portland one should be in there. There are plenty of books. Again, she mentioned some from the National Park Service, and I actually found when I was doing a project in Cedar Rapids that there's a gentleman in Iowa City for $100, $150. You can actually take a sample of your mortar, take it down there, and he will analyze what the composition of that mortar was. If you really want to get back to, you probably want to go all the way back because it probably had absolutely no Portland cement in it, and you may want to put a little in for workability and consistency. But yeah, we'll talk more about mortars, I think, this afternoon.
Yeah, because there's even some techniques you can do to analyze your own, too, that they talk about in some of these books.
Warren?
There isn't any trees in front. Property owners now spend money fixing up the front, and the trees sit there relative straight, and 9 months out of the year, you can't see the building. Their recommendation is, nobody wants to kill a tree, I know that.
Yeah, especially when you're called Tree City, USA, or something like that.
With Nick Berry Memorial Park.
Nick, those were put in at a time when that was the popular
Yeah.
thing to do. But they do add some shade. And, at least keep in mind the kind of trees that were put in are at least a columnar type. They don't spread out like it. It's not like it's a white oak or something.
One other thing about the guidelines in particular is that, and maybe some of you are aware of this and some of you aren't, in any national registered district, there are buildings that are contributing to that district and buildings that are non-contributing. And the non-contributing ones are the ones that have been altered or modified to they've crossed over, there is a threshold of integrity. They've crossed over the line to the point that they would be considered, they're in the district, but they're non-contributing. And so they don't get some of the same tax credit benefits, low interest loans, and grant funding opportunities that a contributing building would. Now, there's a lot that, some buildings are just so far gone that they could never be made contributing, but a lot of the buildings in our district here in Mount Vernon could be made contributing fairly easily. Taking a slipcover off a building could be the difference between a non-contributing and a contributing property. So we're also trying to help educate people about how they can improve their opportunities for help to help maintain their historic building, so that they're not out there doing it all by themselves, type of thing.
Unfortunately, everyone always wonders, is there money out there? There's very little money for restoration projects. In fact, 15 years ago I was on a board and we were trying to figure out how to get rid of some money, and we've gone around to the other spectrum now where it's very hard to come by. There are tax incentives, but I don't strongly, I don't push those on people because it delays the process immensely to qualify for those. Plus, it's probably even more restrictive than what we would be in terms of what you'd have to do. One bit of a little hope, though, is that we did get council approval that as we have money left over in our historic preservation budget, we hope to have a few, 1 or 2, maybe 3, small seed grants in the future for probably the commercial district to help, spur efforts in the commercial district. But beyond that, there's not a lot of hope at this point in time. We are working with the banks to hopefully get them to cooperate in providing some lower interest loans. But And actually, we'd like to get some TIF funds involved, but all of that is in the future, and I wouldn't want someone to predicate a decision to build or not to build based on whether they're going to get grant money or not. Yes.
Sort of document to new homeowners that have moved to the area of which historic districts there are in the community and how to find out about what is there.
Yeah, actually, I think there's, unless we're out of them, right up inside the front door up here for City Hall, there should be a walking tour of Mount Vernon book, and within that book, it should have the boundaries of the historic districts on it. We also have another book that we produced just for background information. You know, we did this Pleasure of Porches tour for quite a few years in Mount Vernon, which was very popular, and each year we went around and wrote descriptions of historic porches, and then I finally compiled those into a little booklet that has descriptions of porches as well as the houses of probably 60, 70, 80 houses in Mount Vernon. We've got a little booklet on that also.
Why don't we take a break?
We're 10 minutes ahead of schedule, so we'll take a quick break.